Chapter 4, Change of Direction. In March 1934, the Air Estimates made provision for 4 new squadrons for the Royal Air Force. However, in July, the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, announced a new 5-year program by which the RAF would be increased by 41 squadrons, or about 860 aircrafts, including those already announced in the March estimates. Winston Churchill, then in the political wilderness, had been loudly and boldly sounding warnings about British inadequacy in the air compared to the resurgence of aeronautical effort in Germany. Now, at last, the penny seemed to have dropped. To us in the Royal Air Force, for so long the ugly duckling of the fighting services, this modest expansion plan seemed the beginning of a new lease of life. At least the major role we knew we had to play in the country's security was recognized by the government, even if it was not yet accepted by the country as a whole. In March 1935, the government received a severe shock when Hitler told Sir John Simon, the Foreign Secretary, on a visit to Berlin, that the German Air Force was already as strong as the Royal Air Force, and that his objective was parity with France. After investigating his claim, Simon wrote a long letter to the Prime Minister on 10 April, giving figures for German Air Force and industry expansion, and ended thus. The conclusion, which might have to be drawn from the above figures, if they are correct, is that this country is seriously open to the threat of sudden attack by continental power in a degree to which it has not been exposed for hundreds of years. So although the government was aware of the threat, and although some, but by no means all, of the national press made much of it, there was a marked reluctance within the country to face unpalatable facts. In April 1935, Bob Preller, my South African friend from 17 Squadron days, conceived the idea of hiring some private aeroplanes from a firm at Heston called Air Hire Limited and touring the continent. He roped me in as well as 2 other flying officers called Patton and John Miners. Under Bob Preller's overall organization, we hired a puss moth to be flown by me, a leopard moth to be flown by Patton, and a 4-seater Avro Commander to be flown by Bob himself. The idea was to find 7 passengers to come with us on a cost-sharing basis and tour Germany and some of the main capitals of Europe. The whole trip lasting from 19 to 24 April. As it turned out, our passengers were all girls except for Miners, and one of the minor miracles of the operation was how Bob Preller managed to talk their respective mothers into allowing them to come. Nevertheless, whatever may have been their misgivings, they seemed to have overcome them. I took off from Heston on 19 April in Pussmouth, GACIV, with Anne Chaplin and an attractive South African girl, and set course for Saarbrücken, 3 hours, 20 minutes flying time away. Patton followed with his passengers in the Leopard, but Bob Preller, delayed by a technical snag, said he would join us in Munich. Saarbrücken had been much in the news, arising from Hitler's agitation for the return of the Tsar to German sovereignty, which had finally been settled in his favor by the plebiscite in January 1935. I was half expecting the airfield to be full of booted and strutting Nazis, but in fact it was a small aerodrome with a wooden terminal and a club building and a pleasant restaurant where we drank some beer in the sun, ate lunch, saw the aircraft safely refueled, and proceeded on our way to Munich in the afternoon. With 2 girls and 3 suitcases in the back, I noticed that the longitudinal control of the aeroplane was now extremely sensitive, and I had to concentrate hard on the flying to avoid giving my fair passengers a switchback sort of ride. Although I did not know it, this was my first experience of flying an aeroplane with inadequate longitudinal stability margins, due to the center of gravity being too far aft. Some years later, this problem, in more extreme forms, was to become part of my daily life. We landed at Oberweisenfeld, then a fair-sized glass aerodrome on the outskirts of Munich, and used the Lufthansa and the local flying clubs. That evening we visited the Bofbrunha, a huge beer keller where Bavarian beer was dispensed in enormous steins carried by powerful, buxom women who seemed able to cope with about 5 in each hand. It was all very large, very festive, and very noisy, and we drank a good deal of the beer accompanied by a variety of suitable food. I remember being greatly impressed by the way our slender and delicate-looking girls polished off steins of beer as if they were cups of tea. We found to our relief that our special tourist checks, introduced by Hitler, gave so favorable a rate of exchange that such an evening cost remarkably little. We spent the following morning seeing something of Munich before going back to the aerodrome to prepare the aircraft for the flight to Vienna. I had trouble starting my Gipsy engine, and suspecting a carburation problem, sought the assistance of Lufthansa. A mechanic arrived wheeling a small trolley with a cylinder of gas, from which extended a long tube. He inserted this into the Gipsy's air intake. We turned the propeller over a few times to suck in some of whatever was in the cylinder. The tube was removed, and the engine started at the first swing. I discovered later that the gas was acetylene, which was probably not very good for the pistons, but was certainly effective. In Vienna, we rode up to the aerodrome in 2 horse-drawn Victorias. On the way to Berlin, we landed at Dresden to refuel. Berlin itself, according to our expectations, somehow it seemed more German than Munich, and officials at Tempelhof were precise, openly efficient, and brusque. Although, as English private aviators and tourists, we were treated with meticulous courtesy. There was an atmosphere we had not noticed in Bavaria and Dresden. Our passports revealed that we were Royal Air Force officers, but we were asked no questions about the purpose of our visit. Next day, we saw some of the sights of Berlin, but personally, I was more interested in watching the Germans themselves and wondering what was really going on in that country, and whether one day we were going to have to fight them all over again. I had never been to Germany before, and so could not compare my impressions with those of a previous visit, but there was a great feeling of vitality and energy about the place, and a certain menace. At the aerodromes, especially at Dresden, there were aircraft of many differing types, some with a decidedly paramilitary aspect. The flying clubs were active and full of bustling, purposeful-looking people, pupils and instructors, all dressed in professional-looking sporting garb, all of which contrasted considerably with the more amateur, relaxed, and casual atmosphere of the English flying clubs. I wish I could say that I left Berlin convinced of German aggressive intentions and that our country was in mortal peril, but this was not the case. Nevertheless, I did gain an uncomfortable and uneasy impression, and I had the feeling that in Britain we were somehow being left behind in a race that had no rules. When I got back to Duxford, at the edge of my leave, Tanks Chamberlain said to me, "Hell, "Have you just been flying around Germany?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Well, you should have gone to the intelligence people for a briefing before you left. You'd better get down and see them right away. I'll fix it up." So next day, I found myself being interviewed in the Air Ministry by a wing commander and a squadron leader, who dressed me down for not coming to see them before I left. They said they could have briefed me about what to look out for and what to do, but as it was, I had probably failed to bring home any information of any use whatsoever. I apologized, but explained that in the first place I had no idea they existed. In the second place, I thought that sort of intelligence was gathered by people in false beards and shabby raincoats, and not by officers on leave. They made me promise that if I did go again, I would see them in good time beforehand. Toward the end of 1935, I was reading the papers one day in the anteroom at Duxford when Pat King, a flight lieutenant on the station, said to me, "By the way, Quill, I saw Mutt Summers over the weekend, and he told me he was looking for a young pilot who might join Vickers and become his assistant test pilot there. I took the liberty of mentioning your name." I said, "Oh, well, as a matter of fact, I am not due to leave the service for another 10 months. I've been posted to Martlesham from January, so I presume I'll be offered a permanent commission, or at least a medium service commission. They're unlikely to send me to a place like Martlesham just for a few months, so I'm afraid I wouldn't be interested in going to Vickers at this particular moment. Still, thanks all the same for mentioning my name." "Well," said Pat King, "I've told you about it. If you're interested, give Mutt a ring and fly down to Brooklands to see him. Otherwise, forget it." My immediate reaction was indeed to forget it. I wanted to stay in the Royal Air Force, and felt that now that the expansion program was underway, I had a good chance of being selected for a permanent commission. I had not perpetuated any glaring misdemeanors. My flying record was tolerably good, and I had accumulated a good deal more than the average number of hours in the air. Why should I want to become a civilian test pilot? However interesting it might sound, no, my future lay in the RAF, I said to myself. Flight Lieutenant Shorty Horry, the adjutant at Duxford, had been a test pilot at Martlesham, and we often used to talk about his work. When I told him I had decided not to follow up the Vickers job, he pointed out that this was a great chance and that I was gambling everything on getting a permanent commission of which there was no certainty. "And suppose you do get one," he argued. "It will be fine while the flap lasts and the expansion carries on, but as soon as they sort this thing out politically, they'll cut the money and slam on the brakes, and there'll be a god-awful promotion blockage. Look at me. I fought in the war, and I'm still only a flight lieutenant." Doubts began to assail me. I thought of an uncle who had served in the First World War and was still a captain in the DCLI. Could it also happen in the RAF? In spite of the situation in Germany and the commotion over Mussolini in Abyssinia, I tended to feel like Shorty, that there would be some kind of political solution, that the flap would die down, and that his gloomy predictions about a promotion block might well turn out to be right. Furthermore, the Times very much played down the threat from Hitler's Germany and was strongly supporting the policy of appeasement, an attitude which, to its discredit, it maintained almost up to the outbreak of the war. Had I been sure of a permanent commission, there would have been no question of even thinking about a job in the industry. But I could not be. But I could not be. I contacted Mutt Summers at Vickers and flew to Brooklands on 1st November. Mutt told me what the job was, to help him with a heavy program of experimental prototype flying, both at Weybridge and with Supermarine down at Southampton, which was brewing up as a result of the expansion program. If I was interested, I would have to fly down again for an interview with Sir Robert McLean, the chairman. When I told him that my short service commission did not expire until October 1936, he said the job would not wait. I would have to apply for early release or forget it. I thought I would go ahead with the interview with Sir Robert, and in the unlikely event that I was offered the job, would then have to make my decision. I remember vaguely hoping that I would not be, thus relieving me of the problem. I flew to Brooklands again on 18 November and lunched with Mutt Summers and Sir Robert, followed by a short interview with the latter. The result was that I was offered the job of assistant to the chief test pilot at a salary of £500 a year, conditional to my applying for immediate release from the Royal Air Force. I asked for 2 weeks to decide. I flew my Siskin back to Duxford in a state of great uncertainty and wished that the whole damn business had not cropped up. The next 2 weeks I spent in a turmoil of indecision. The truth was that I did not wish to leave the Royal Air Force, but Sir Robert had looked me in the eye and said, I could not remember an occasion when I have been able to offer such a young man so great an opportunity as I am offering you today. My iPad's giving me problems, so we're going to try this on the phone again. I went to my CO Tanks Chamberlain and asked him if he had any means of knowing whether I was on the list for a permanent commission. He rang up a friend in P staff at Air Ministry, but such information could not be divulged. I wrote to Sir Philip Sassoon and had a charming and courteous reply, but was none the wiser. So I had to make up my own mind. A lot of medium service 10-year commissions were being awarded at the time, but that was not what I wanted. With the utmost reluctance, I concluded that reliance upon the award of permanent commission was too big a gamble. I telephoned to Mutt Summers and said I was applying for early release. Could I please have something in writing to substantiate my application? So on 28 December 1935, I carried out a routine Met climb in Siskin J8882, which was my last sortie in the Met flight, and indeed the last flight of my short service commission. On the last day of the year, having said my goodbyes, I piled my modest luggage into the back of my old 3-liter Bentley and headed off from Duxford towards London with very mixed feelings. It was not so good pretending that I was not quite excited at joining the rather exclusive band of test pilots in the British aircraft industry, but I had the gravest misgivings about leaving the RAF. I had felt absolutely a part of it from the day I joined, and I had always had an inner certainty that I was destined to stay in it. I had become accustomed to the life and loved it, and found it hard to visualize any other. As my old Bentley went burbling along through Royston and Stevenage on the way to London, with the distinctive throaty exhaust note emanating from its low revving engine, I felt very much alone, almost like a little boy running away from home and wondering what the future would hold. I remembered the strong feeling of homecoming and warmth which I had always experienced as I drove in through the gates of the Royal Air Force Station when returning from leave. I was always acutely conscious of crossing a threshold between the outside world, uncertain, potentially unfriendly, and inhabited by a different breed of people. Into a familiar world which I thoroughly understood, which was well ordered, and in which the aims and obligations and duties were clear and not in question, that I would not again experience this warm feeling of belonging to the RAF filled me with depression and a certain amount of apprehension. Suddenly I realized I was on my own. I also began to think of Vickers, that firm long established had produced a number of very successful aeroplanes, yet they seemed to me to have stolen, not very inspired, and perhaps rather mundane or workhorse in their general characteristics. But Mutt Summers had told me of a new high-performance fighter which was due to emerge from Supermarine at Southampton, designed by the famous R.J. Mitchell, and also that there was a new fighter coming out from Vickers at Weybridge, and that I should be needed to help with the testing of both these aircraft. This thought cheered me up considerably.